It's time for Supply Chain Now Radio, broadcasting live from the supply chain capital of the country, Atlanta, Georgia. Supply Chain Now Radio spotlights the best in all things supply chain. The people, the technologies, the best practices, and the critical issues of the day. And now, here are your hosts.
Hey, good morning. Scott Luton here with you live on Supply Chain Now Radio. Welcome back to the show. Today's show is going to focus on the circular economy, one of the most talked about topics in the global supply chain. Elimination of waste, implementing more sustainable business practices, and much, much more. We're going to dive in momentarily with a brilliant thought leader in this space. Like all of our series on Supply Chain Now Radio, you can find our replays on a variety of channels: Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, YouTube, all the places you find your podcast today. As always, we'd love to have you subscribe so you don't miss anything. Let's thank all of our sponsors for allowing us to bring best practices and innovative ideas to you, our audience. Spend management experts, Verison, The Effective Syndicate, Vector Global Logistics, and many, many more. Be sure to check out our sponsors on the show notes of this episode. Okay, so let's welcome in our featured guest speaker today, Miss Deborah Dole, Principal, Supply Chain Product Management, GE Digital. How you doing, Deborah?
Fantastic. How are you?
Doing fantastic as well. Great to have you here in Atlanta.
Thank you for having me.
Especially as often as you travel. We were going through on the warm up all the different stops you make, and I've never seen a busier schedule. I don't know how you do it.
It may be true, may not be true. It's a lot of fun.
It is. It must be. And we're going to dive into some of your experiences on today's podcast. But before we talk about some of the business topics, I want to get a better sense of who you are and kind of paint a picture for our audience. So tell us more about your background.
Sure thing. So I grew up actually in the middle of Washington State, one of those biggest small towns around communities. And for whatever reason, I am a city person. So I'm not sure how that developed, but that has led to a life of adventure and travel, exploration. I like new items, new foods, new cities, new sounds. And I stuck around for university up in Western Washington University, right on the Canadian border. Highly recommend. And then have continued since then.
So, being a city person, give us, with all of your travels, what are some of your favorite stops here in the last, say, year or two?
Sure thing. So I had the opportunity to live in London for a couple of years, and that will remain a top key highlight. About the right city size, I'm finding about 10 million is my ideal size of a city. Bigger than that gets a little bit more tough. Yep. So New York falls in that as well. But I will give a shout out to my favorite country to visit is Slovenia. Okay. It's like mini Europe. It's nice. It's fun. And they actually have quite a few circular economy initiatives. Who would have thought?
In Slovenia?
Slovenia.
Really?
Yes.
Now, do you remember where you flew into? Where did you fly into to get to Slovenia?
You can go through a couple of major European cities. Okay. I usually go through London or Amsterdam, and you fly into the capital, Ljubljana, which has more consonants than you think it should have.
Okay. All right. And I'm not going to ask you to spell it because I know I would fail that spelling test. All right. So let's talk about some of your early hobbies, especially some of your early hobbies that you think kind of factored into what you do now.
Sure thing. Early hobbies, no relation to what I'm doing now, of course. Okay. That may not be true. I started playing the violin in elementary school, and that led to a tendency towards clubs, music, etc., rather than sports. Yep. My parents had a policy at the time that we could do one extracurricular.
Just one?
Yep.
Focus
on school. So you start one, and then that becomes a focus. And so later on in high school, I was in every type of club you can imagine: math club, drama club, orchestra. And then I also joined DECA. Okay. And that's really where the business and supply chain focus was started.
Well, would you argue that, when I think of someone that plays the violin or really any musical instrument, the level of discipline, especially to do it well, not necessarily master it, but to do it well. And for me, discipline really certainly plays a strong role in business. Is that a natural connection that you see?
Yeah, that's a great point. The ability to self-regulate as young, 8 or 9, 10 years old, as you're starting to set aside practice time, get over performance nerves, figure out how to work with others as you're doing, small music. It's really interesting.
Orchestration, right? Orchestration.
That's funny.
Well, so we did an episode several months back with a supply chain leader that really talked about supply chain orchestration. And it just makes so much sense, especially when you think about the different segments of an orchestra and everything that all the timing, the cadence, and the coordination and the I'm not gonna say this word right, synchronicity, right?
Right.
That it has to go on to really do it well. So
absolutely. And the conductor would be our control tower.
Yeah, there we go.
That's really the way I would think about it, because you have a plan. It's a pretty specific plan, but it doesn't go to plan. So you have to have somebody there to help you correct it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what. Hopefully our audience is too, but I'm picturing this. There's so many more supply chain puns we could apply to it, but that's a good way of putting it. I like the control tower. All right, so let's talk about your career. We're going to talk more about what you're doing now with GE Digital, but before we go there, let's talk about what you did prior to that. And there's two main stops I wanted to kind of dive deeper in. So Microsoft, everyone is familiar with that global brand. What did you do there?
Yeah, I started almost immediately after school. I took a year off after university, actually, and then I went to Microsoft starting as a transportation analyst. Can really highly recommend starting as an analyst to folks coming out of school. And then I worked on a team who really moves us around a lot, and so had the opportunity to have multiple different roles, all I'd say post-manufacturing, so heavy focus on inventory, supplier management, et cetera.
Inventory, we're going to talk more about inventory, right?
I love inventory. And most notably, I was on the team that launched Surface V1 and Microsoft retail stores. Okay. Which was really fun.
So what version are we on now with Surface, do you know?
Well, they just announced new foldable devices, and they're called, I think, Neo and Duo. And I don't really know what they're using X now, and I don't know now that's at 10 or is it just hipper than calling it a number? I'm not sure.
Interesting.
Several versions later.
But you were on the team that launched Surface V1, and clearly that was a successful product.
Absolutely.
Yep. And transportation analyst is where you started. I bet that really factored into, gave you a great root level understanding of end-to-end supply chain. I bet that kind of factored out later in your career.
Absolutely. It was a really interesting role. For the first time, the team I was on had access to their end-to-end shipping information all the way to the last mile. And there's 120 data fields, and I'd never done data analysis before, but it helped me understand the relationship of financials to supply chain. And you can almost be like a detective when you see, ooh, this didn't go well, or it went higher or lower, why? And then you end up finding out. And that really has helped me through my career of the understanding of finance in supply chain. And I'm finding to be a really, really important skill.
Absolutely. Especially here in 2019 and beyond. Okay, so at Microsoft, you're on some big projects there, especially big projects that continue this day and in different iterations. Let's talk about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in a couple of different ways. Let's talk about what you did there, and then I'd love to, if you're willing to share, kind of talk about one of the relationships that kind of a random conversation, uncoordinated conversation has led to. So let's talk about what you did there first.
Sure thing. So the Gates Foundation, as many of you probably already know, have multiple different strategies to making the world a better place. And so a strategy for them might be HIV or malaria or U.S. education. And over time, they've found that supply chain challenges continue to constrain their success and the success of the countries that they're helping. And so they started to lean into the supply chain space. So I joined a couple years back and had never worked in international development. Fascinating space, right? You've got these big donor organizations, and compared to all of them, the foundation's actually quite small when you compare them to country governments like the US or the United Kingdom. And then you've got all the different partner organizations really trying to implement these strategies in the countries that we're working in. Really, really interesting. the assumptions that I had been taught about supply chain, that you would have a network, a developed market, that you would have some semblance of a demand signal, that you might maybe know where your inventory is potentially. Those went out the window. And so really relearning supply chain in a way, and being a champion for supply chain concepts across the community, it was really, really fascinating.
What a outstanding opportunity, that challenge all of your current assumptions and kind of what you knew, and it seems like that experience really had you look at not just the supply chain world, but maybe the global business world differently.
Absolutely. One of the most difficult concepts to think about was putting together a learning session for Bill and Melinda, and the premise of that was Bill asking, "Why is supply chain so hard?"
Great question. And
Yep,
as we
tough to answer.
Tough to answer. Lots of different answers. But as we were talking about in the warm-up conversation, it's really important to be asking the questions that there's not a perfect preformed answer to, right? Okay, so APICS and the ASM community are important to us here. I've been a long-time volunteer with the within this community. In fact, we interviewed Abe Ashkenazi towards the beginning of the year.
Oh, wonderful.
Fascinating conversation to sit down and kind of hear him and his thought leadership and his vision and where the organization's going. However, what I learned in the pre-show is that you had a very interesting conversation that has had some pretty big ripple effects. So tell us more about that.
Sure thing. A couple years ago, I had the opportunity to pick a fun compensation concept at the foundation. They don't have traditional compensation packages, and so for a job well done, I could pick a conference to go to. That was my choice. And of course, I picked, at the time it was still APICS, in San Antonio. And my plan was to kind of blend in with the crowd and just nerd out on, inventory, of course, and other fun topics. But because my registration was sort of flagged, and I found myself together with the UN in a room and started talking through some of these big challenges and global opportunities we have, I found myself fairly quickly together with Abe Ashkenazi, the CEO of now ASCM, and we realized that our vision was very, very aligned. And that kicked off a series of exploratory conversations, which now so happy to see an increased focus on frontier markets. So they're heavily involved in different African countries, together with their partner there, SAPICS, who I also have had the delight to get to know over the years.
Oh, have you met Jenny Froome?
Absolutely. Oh. Jenny, you are such a force, such a positive role model. She's one of my favorite people.
Mine and yours, and we have that in common. We connected with Jenny and interviewed her and got her perspective on a wide variety of supply chain topics and issues, and they're doing such great work and important work in Africa, and just as personable, and I'm going to make a vast generalization, but I've been supporting manufacturing in supply chain in some capacity for about 17 years. And you come across all types of people, but there's a lot of straight-laced, button-down folks, all about just the mission, right? And you got to have that. That's really important to have. And then occasionally, or maybe more than occasionally, you'll find people that just are colorful personalities and just so it's like a breath of fresh air, right?
Absolutely.
And you need people like that too. And Jenny strikes me as one of those leaders that really is fun to work with and probably work for, and they're doing such critical work there, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the conversation, what I heard there, the conversation that you had with Abe that was spontaneous, has now blossomed into a strong partnership between ASCM and the Gates Foundation, right?
Absolutely. They, Abe had these concepts in mind already, and so I can say that it was likely an accelerator to the plans they already had. They've just announced the launch of the ASCM Foundation at conference a couple weeks ago, and really leading incredible discussions across the African continent, and just really, really excited to follow their work, and I'm so humbled to be able to have been at the beginning with them.
Absolutely. Fascinating. Okay. So switching gears here a little bit, we want to dive into kind of why supply chain for you. We've had so many conversations, and we actually have a dedicated series where we explore and interview and spotlight all the wonderful women that lead different businesses and lead different parts of the global end-to-end supply chain. It's something we've got to work on better as an industry, providing opportunities, not just to get into the industry, but also certainly to progress and get into the upper tiers of leadership. So whenever I always love to hear whoever we're interviewing, kind of why supply chain, but in particular, female leaders. So why supply chain for you, Deborah?
Great question. So I'll say tripped and fell into supply chain. I was pursuing a business administration degree, originally a marketing major, because I had the goal of moving out of the United States. And I didn't know a lot about the global world, but I figured, hey, everybody buys something, so marketing must be translatable. And as part of that, I took an operations management course. On the first day of the course, we had to write down our goals.
What year in school was this?
I started operations management back probably 2006.
Okay.
I graduated in 2007.
Okay.
Found it very late. Made for a very, very busy last year. But our professor asked us to write down a goal for the quarter. My goal was, what is operations management? So that was my starting level. But he handed out the syllabus and then actually did a lecture, and it was about planning a very fancy, robust Thanksgiving meal.
Okay.
And then he said, cool, yeah, we can have lobster, we can have whatever you want, but now here's the deal. You've got one oven, and you've got one, what do you call them when you put the pots on it?
Stovetop.
A burner. One single burner.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Great. And so it was brilliant, because in the moment he taught us work back schedule, and he taught us resource constraint. And understanding theory of constraints has been such a core part of the different roles I've had. And in fact, is the basis of a frontier markets maturity model that I built for Bill and Melinda together with the team there. And so this idea of constraints, I think is core to supply chain, because a good supply chain professional can truly understand the constraints. So don't take them as assumptions, but push hard on, is that a real constraint or an artificial constraint? And then be super clever within those constraints. And I think that separates supply chain professionals out of many other professions.
Well put. I love the Thanksgiving. Do you remember that professor's name? If not, we'll have to look it up.
Yeah, that is Jerry Hahn. He's now retired again. I think he's tried to retire several times. It was an incredibly impactful force in my life. He convinced me to join the field, even though I said, I don't really think I want to do this. And then he also convinced me to go to my Microsoft interview. And at the time, I was just doing a sales job, and I said, really? I'm going to have to get rid of a whole day of commission. You want me to go where? And he said, you get off your bum, come up here and interview for Microsoft. And so he's a big force in my life.
That's awesome to hear. It seems like that more and more we interview folks, it's these pivotal role models that push us to do things that on its face maybe we're do we want to do this, not. But these are critical moments in our journeys, and it sounds like Professor Jerry Hahn was one of those for you.
Absolutely.
And we're going to steal his Thanksgiving exercise. That is.
It's so clever.
Yes.
So clever.
So what did the meal turn out okay?
I'm not entirely sure we actually fixed it, because we were making multiple different courses, meats. I think we had to start, 5 days before or something like that.
Gotcha. Okay. So let's talk, before we dive into circular economy and pose some tough questions to you and get some of your perspective. Let's talk more about everyone has heard of GE as a global brand, global iconic brand. GE Digital may be new for some folks. So let's talk about your role and of course, what GE Digital does as well.
Absolutely. This has been a really fun role for me. As I mentioned in the beginning, I really enjoy new experiences. And so moving from Microsoft into the foundation, and now a brand new industry for me, which is industry. fascinating space. And so how GE Digital started was a couple of years ago as, Industry 4.0 was really starting to take off. And the realization that sensors and data science can actually predict how large industrial equipment functions. And by using those techniques, you can keep the world running. So instead of having, an airplane sitting on a tarmac and all of us inside and we're angry, or, having an elevator breakdown, or, a number of just the way the world works and spins.
Right.
You go over and want to flip on the light and nothing happens.
We love our lights here.
We do love lights. And all of that is because of the industrial world. And so the concept started because many of GE's customers went to GE and said, hey, we're trying to solve this big problem. How do you do it? And the realization that the internal solutions that have been created could actually be shared with their customers. And so they started this digital solutions division. And now we really focus on applications for the industrial world. So again, imagine shop floors now are more and more digitized. So we need ways to just run those. There's execution systems, there's automation systems, understanding the confluence of sensors, and again, using that back end of data science. So it's been really, really interesting to watch.
So, Deborah, as you came here to our studio here at Vector Global Logistics, which the team is busy at work, closing deals, making it happen, but we're here at King Ploughs where the studio and the offices are. And as you come through, you walk past a huge press that dates back to when they were making plows here at this manufacturing site. And so today's manufacturing day. The episode won't publish for a couple weeks, but today is manufacturing day. And I can't. Every time I walk past this press, you think about how tough manufacturing can be, and how many smart, hardworking people that it takes to make all these things that I'm sure many of us take for granted. But it also reminds me just how all the opportunities that the digitization of the space is providing for people as well. Especially folks who are willing to learn new things and step through doors and raise their hand and volunteer and willing to apply all those things they learn. But what I also love that I think I heard you say is as things become more digital, we can get out in front of problems proactively.
Exactly.
Right? And this is where we get into saving lives and keeping the economy happen and numerous other noble missions that supply chain can address, right?
That's exactly right. The back end of the world, I would call it, where we normally walking around as consumers, we don't think about it. Again, you flip a light switch, you get on an escalator, you get on an airplane, you get on a train, and you just expect these to work, similar to how we run in our normal individual lives, right? You go to the grocery store, you expect something's on the shelf.
Right.
You don't really think about the way it gets there, and maybe it's different for us supply chain folks. We think about how it gets there, but I find the same is applicable to the industrial world, and it's hugely complicated, really, really interesting, and really is the big contributor when we start talking about circular economy in a couple minutes.
So it really is. I mean, if folks are listening to this, I'm sure you're right. We do take that. All of us take it for granted, right? Whether it's the smartphones we use, whether it's the light switch, especially here in the U.S. where electricity just happens.
Right.
And if it doesn't happen, it's like, everything stops. In other parts of the world, brownouts and in some cases blackouts is part of
very standard.
Yeah. So on big high five to all the folks that are in manufacturing, have been in manufacturing to get us where we are, and it's really exciting to hear what GE Digital, how it's enabling a lot of the digitization of the industry. I mean, it's been here, it is here, it's where the future is, but what we like to bang the drum on is it doesn't mean there's no opportunities for humans. Again,
right.
It's folks that want to learn new things, and I love this notion of cobots, right? Working alongside, leveraging all of this technology to do new, bigger things, right?
Absolutely, and 4.0 is a job generator. So there's been quite a few studies and articles on this, and it's really interesting to watch where the world is shifting, and the supply chain Community specifically will become what I'll quote unquote smarter, as in more use of technology.
Right.
Grads today are at an advantage when they double up with MIS or data analytics, and they're comfortable with the forward-facing technologies that 5 years from now will become very, very common.
Right. All right, so it's fascinating. We could spend several hours on some of the projects you're on and some of the conversations I'm sure you're having. But let's talk about the circular economy, partially because, very selfishly, I want to learn more and hear it from someone that is in it every day and looking to make it better and make it more of a reality maybe. But let's kind of set the table first. So in your words, how would you define this notion, this phrase, circular economy?
Sure. So if we think about today, and I'd say for the last 150 years or so, how we produce items or give services, it's a line. It goes linearly. So it's called the linear economy. We take raw materials, typically which starts from a mine, goes through a series of manufacturing steps, as we all know, ends up being used either as a consumer product or an industrial process, and then is disposed. So it's this take, make, waste line, and we all in supply chain know it's not really truly a straight line.
Right.
It's part of a network.
Right.
But the idea is that these resources and materials have value, and a lot of times are being thrown away. And sometimes it's, we look at the metals that are inside of a cell phone, for example, and it's not always financially possible to get every last bit of that before the rest of it is disposed of. But what the circular economy says is, look, this material has value and designed properly can be circulated. And materials are split into two sections. One they call renewable, so something like heat or water or composting, so something that would go back into the biosphere. But we know it needs to be done responsibly. We know that just randomly putting things out in the world has negative consequences. And then the other type is technical materials like plastics and metals. And the premise of this global economy is when the item has finished its useful life, you want to keep it as itself as long as possible. Something about a used car, we want to keep it as a car and have somebody else use it. And then if that's not going to work, we want to shift it just a little bit. So maybe it's, these vans we see that are now becoming small, tiny homes. And then you will actually end up recycling the materials, which is actually sort of our less, you wouldn't start there. You want to reuse the material, keep it as itself as long as possible. And with this, we're finding that economic impact is pretty significant. So we don't have to start all over again with raw materials. So it's actually faster, it's cheaper, done well. And of course, the challenge here is we're right at the beginning of this journey, and 10 years from now, it'll be much more commonplace. These global marketplaces, materials exchanges, these will all be running at scale. And so we're seeing some new concepts, but so far, we're not quite at the global circular economy, but that's where we all think it's going.
Would you agree? It seems like when I think about when I came into the workforce and where we are now, from a recycling, from a need, from an importance and a priority, it seems like the needle has shifted dramatically in the last 5 or 10 years, at least in this country. Do you see that same thing, and do you see the same thing globally in your travels? Sure.
I am encouraged by somewhat of a shift. So yes, we're embracing recycling more, and we're seeing more of a shift of reuse first.
Yes. Yeah.
And as I spent time living and working in Europe, for example, you'll see bottles, glass or plastic, that are built durably, and they wash those and reuse it. So they don't recycle first because it takes a lot of energy. It's really expensive. It's actually cheaper to just wash the bottle and use it again. And so as this type of reuse wave starts to introduce itself into American markets, this is where we're going to start seeing reusable containers for consumers, reusable pallets, reusable shipping containers, and we'll start to see more of the showcases here.
In applying reuse and repurposing to a bigger scale, and here at King Plow, I love the fact that they have protected this architecture with such character, right? Rather than raise it and then put a concrete cinder block that we see everywhere else, and just repurposing and reusing this material. Pont City Market in Atlanta, I'm not sure if you've ever visited that in your travels here, was an old, long forgotten, I want to say an old Sears department store. I could be getting that wrong. I'm sure Malcolm will correct me if I do have it wrong. But now they've repurposed it and rebuilt it into one of the most vibrant multi-store, multi-purpose facilities in the city.
Oh, that's great.
And it pulls people to, again, protecting that character and protecting all those resources that went into it as well. So I love to see that rather than, the alternative.
Yeah, and I think the construction industry has done a tremendous job of reclaiming, and it's become really hip. Like, wow, this table was made from reclaimed whatever. Ooh, cool, old railroad ties used in this other way. It's now a chandelier.
Yep.
And so being really creative, building materials coming from unexpected places has become really, really hip. And so I'm hoping that same shift can apply to other industries as well. Absolutely.
So let's talk about supply chain as it relates to the circular economy. You're touched on some of that, some of this a little bit as you were defining it. But how do you see supply chain and supply chain leaders and supply chain organizations using the circular economy as a strategy?
Absolutely. For me, when I think about the circular economy, the key focus for supply chain leaders is not to pursue circular because it's the flavor of the day. Rather, investigate how circular can actually be a strategy to achieving the business goals you already have. And in supply chain, we typically balance, of course, time, cost, quality, normally as service level.
Yep.
And I'm finding that circular business practices can really help you get there. So I was just doing a brainstorm for a panel I'll be on in a couple weeks at Field Services Connect in Texas, and speaking with a professor who I'll be co-presenting with, and he really is exploring circular as a speed strategy. So if we think about something like the aftermarket, spare parts, we've already been refurbishing spare parts for a long time in the industry, but consider that almost to the next level where I predict in the future spare parts could be sort of in network and out of network. So you have your spare parts, but maybe with the location you're going to provide service, your spare parts are the wrong way. But somebody else has spare parts that you could go, then they've been refurbished and you could reuse them, and you can actually get there faster. And then, of course, it's much less expensive if you can refurb or reuse or somehow just tweak it a little bit rather than starting from scratch. Some of these spare parts, take over a year to produce. And so it's great any way we can make that faster. And so investigating these types of practices, I think, can really benefit business processes. So we had Rod Shurkin on the podcast. We just published his episode, and he offered up an 8-point plan for how you can really optimize a manufacturing plant tour, especially if you're evaluating suppliers. But one of the neat things he mentioned that ties in with what you just said there is, for customers that ask their suppliers, how can we be a better customer? And, sometimes tolerances can be too tight, right? Maybe it made sense when you're designing the part or this, that, or the other, but then once it hits production, maybe it's a tolerance because it's always been there. What I heard you say, how can we question those assumptions? And if we do successfully, we can find new ways of eliminating waste, eliminating scrap, refurb, reuse, just produce things smarter, right? Absolutely. This is where I'm really excited that the circular economy discussion is happening in overlap with Industry 4.0. I find that I have a working hypothesis that circular cannot happen at scale until 4.0 matures, I'm going to say until about 80%.
Okay.
I hypothesize that the fifth industrial revolution will actually overlap with the fourth.
Okay.
And I think it'll be something like a green revolution. So how do we actually exist longer on our planet? And we see a lot of the student protests really changing the dialogue globally on that topic. But when I think about what's actually needed to learn more about where waste is produced in your process, for example, I think technology can help us. We can take the traditional approaches of Lean, Kaizen, Six Sigma, of going to Gemba, seeing with our eyes. But, these processes are pretty complicated these days. There's a lot happening inside of a machine that we just can't see as humans, but the machine can. And so this concept of a cobot may be applied to going and finding waste and finding problems. And I'll actually be doing a webinar next week, Wednesday.
Okay.
Produced through GE Digital's website. I can give you the link for the notes. And in there, I explore, lean management to the circular economy. Start with finding waste, reduce it as much as you can, but there will always be materials in our processes. And so how do we circulate those to have monetary benefit to both us, our suppliers, and our customers?
Yeah, the neat thing here, because the flavor of the month is such a dangerous notion, right?
Right.
And it's always been there. Folks, leaders will gravitate to something, do it a month, or until it gets harder than what they think, and then it goes away, and the teams get tired of that.
Right.
The neat thing about the circular economy, though, is one of the core principles is the elimination of waste, which of course has been around, especially in supply chain and manufacturing, for decades, right? And so some of the most successful companies have such a strong culture around constantly asking the question, constantly, how can we get better? How can we improve? How can we eliminate this waste? So I am encouraged that is one of the reasons that will make the circular economy thinking and perspective more prevalent and will grow and take root.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about in the circular economy. Question for you: does everything become inventory?
As we've all established, inventory is my most favorite topic.
Yes, it is.
I think about this a lot, and there's those two categories of materials, like I mentioned, renewables, which I don't think this will apply to. But if I think about technical materials, we're seeing more discussion about tracking a material life over life over life. And of course, the technology parts all exist separately today. They're not necessarily... they may be cost prohibitive still. The scale may be a challenge. How all those different parts work together, we're not there yet. But technically speaking, we could, this microphone I'm speaking into, each of the components should be seen as a separate part.
Right.
Because let's fast forward 15, 20 years from now, even 10 years from now, some of the major metals in the earth will just not be there anymore. So we're going to run out of gold actually pretty quickly. And so instead of our sourcing managers going out and looking at commodities markets, for example, they need another way to find materials that can then be repurposed and make into, maybe this microphone becomes a shoe or something like that afterwards.
You never know.
We never know. And so how do we go through and truly understand where materials are today that can then feed into our manufacturing processes, similarly to how we already need to understand where our raw materials are going to come from today? Just the source of those materials are going to fundamentally shift in the coming decade.
Have you seen the new Nike facility called The Court? Have you heard about this?
I have heard about it.
Okay.
I have not seen it myself.
Okay, well, on your travels to Europe next, or each week, check out The Court. I can't remember the exact location. Malcolm will shoot us a note on this, I'm sure. But anyway, this is one of, I think it's going to be their most sustainable facility. It's going to help them serve Africa and European customers. And they have put so much practical design into how they design to really make it very, very sustainable, including simple notions, but it can be hard to accomplish. Putting the site effectively next to the canal system so that they can eliminate truckload deliveries. I think 14,000 truckload deliveries per year are eliminated because they're going to be utilizing the waterways more effectively. Recycling all of the waste there on site. It's just amazing what they have put into. But this really represents kind of where we're headed, right? That level of design, because it's tough to take a facility where that design has not been baked into the thinking and then try to apply sustainable...
Retrofit.
Right,
yeah,
retrofit,
exactly.
Yes.
And Nike's been such a tremendous leader in the circular economy space anyway. Just this April, I attended an accelerator workshop with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and they've been really the major force behind circular economy. And Nike hosted us just outside of Portland at their headquarters and shared some of their product design. And as we think about the circular economy, two major groups have been engaged so far: designers, not surprising, and scientists. I'll say chemists, because we need to change the way that we do chemistry. John Warner is a great one to Google if you're interested in this.
John Warner?
John Warner. I'll send you the link again for the notes. Father of green chemistry. He's saying, look, we need to change the way that we do science, and then we can survive longer. We can make better use of materials. Really interesting perspectives. But I'm excited to hear about this Nike facility because traditionally we're applying design to products. But we really need to start designing processes in a totally different way. And when we start talking about, industrial processes, that gets me really excited, because industry really is going to be impacting what happens in the world as we go forward.
So check this out, Deborah. So Ham, Belgium. Ham, Belgium's where the court is. I call it the court. 1.5 million square foot facility. It's going to, as what we mentioned, it's going to help the company better serve millions of consumers across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. The court runs on 100% clean energy from 5 different sources: wind, solar, geothermal, hydroelectric, biomass.
Wow.
And it's this type of build is part of their thinking, where they're trying to be zero carbon by 2025. And I think one of the places they're starting here in recent efforts is eradicating waste from their supply chain.
Tremendous. That's great to hear. I'll have to go by, have some great beer.
That's right.
And then stop by Ham.
That's right. I hope that'll be pronounced ham here in the States. I had to kind of reread that and train myself. That one syllable threw me off. But what a kind of raising the bar move with Nike, and it'll be interesting to kind of see how that plays out across industry and new builds. Okay, so let's now talk about, you mentioned inventory a couple of times, and I kind of gathered this notion from our pre-show banter. So you kind of describe yourself as an inventory nerd. So why is this?
Sure. I was having a conversation with somebody the other day and mentioned, I see the world through inventory turns. Anything. So what's one of your favorite pastimes, for example?
Favorite pastimes would be Clemson football or Braves baseball. We can't talk about the Braves here today, though.
I understand. So let's just take a generic sports stadium.
Okay.
Wow. So think about everything that flows in and out of that stadium every day. So people, we are their inventory. So we come in and out. They need to be fast about how inventory can flow. So they do a lot of design on people flow. Just imagine the beer, the food that has to come in, and it's all about turns, right? How fast can we get that to turn in a responsible way? So staying on this food topic, for example, as I've traveled around the world to lots of different types of countries, I typically gravitate towards street food.
Okay.
Normally,
it is delicious.
Yes, but it has to be under the right circumstances, right? So I like the places that have longer lines, because their inventory is turning faster. So I'm encouraged when I'm fairly convinced that they sell to zero at the end of the day, versus a restaurant that you don't know what's going on back there necessarily. So as I've done a lot of travels through Africa, for example, some of my best meals have been just, in alleyways with open fires, and there's no more food at the end of the day. So they start from fresh every day. Love
that. And I've never really thought of it that way. I figured I was going to learn. I've got about 17 pages of notes already, Deborah. But that's a really neat way of thinking about where you get your food and why you get your food. Because if the inventory is churning faster, it's going to be fresher ingredients.
Absolutely. I really hope that this impacts the way that you walk around. And I hope you see inventory, because, wow, to me, it's fascinating.
Well, I can see now why it'd be kind of neat to be an inventory nerd. I might have to be an honorary one.
Maybe we can start a club.
So I should give a shout out to Malcolm. He and she helped me out on the Ham Belgium site, and he and she also confirmed that the Ponce Market was a former Sears, huge department store. So good stuff, Malcolm.
In a couple of weeks, I'll be pulling with a small group of volunteers. We are bringing the Circular Economy Club Circular Cities Week concept to Seattle for the very first time. And this is relevant because Starbucks headquarters has agreed to host us, which I'm really excited about. And it's an old Sears building. So same type. And one of the women helping to coordinate this, her mom worked at Sears and has such a cool story about repairability. And appliances used to be that anybody could repair their own appliance. They would send out repair guides. And actually just in Europe, I think in Scotland, they just passed the right to repair law. So if you think about today, it's actually pretty hard to repair stuff. We've sort of built obsolescence into our lives.
Yeah, that and we all, depending on the sector, we kind of control the IP, right?
Right. And so now seeing that there is an advantage to being able to actually repair, iPhone has actually changed their design to make it repairable and more modular. So we can actually take it apart with newer models where before they were basically industrial superglued shut. Interesting.
Did not know this. And going back to the event at Starbucks, we love Starbucks, by the way, especially, we are, as a veteran, we really are passionate about helping our veteran community. And Starbucks is one of the companies that get it, and they've hired a lot of veterans and veteran spouses. And they're also doubling down on the initiative. I think they've hired like 15,000 veterans or veteran spouses, and I think they're going to raise that to 25,000 in the next few years. So big fans of Starbucks. But it's interesting you mentioned that you're meeting there in an old Sears facility. Unfortunately, we're probably going to have opportunities to meet in more old Sears facility. That's been it's been a very interesting story of how that's played out. But it's great to see, as that's part of the business life cycles, right? So it's really neat to see us in different groups reuse these facilities rather than calling the bulldozers. Okay, so we've talked about the inventory nerd, which I like. There's two things I want to ask you about, because I think these next two opportunities present ways that our audience can plug in more with some of the things you're touching on. First, I wish I could plug into Paris. I'm very jealous. You're going to Paris here in just a few weeks, like a month or so. Tell us more about what's going on there in November.
Absolutely. As I've gone through and engaged with both the industrial community and the circular economy community, I'm finding that there is not a space for supply chain leaders to get together to talk circular and really, really in depth. So past what we can find online. And I found a couple other folks who are saying, yeah, we just don't have that dedicated forum. So after a couple of weeks of brainstorming, we are going to host this event together with ASCM at our innovation center in Paris. And it's a 2-day event with an additional third day to play a game called the Blue Connection. Highly recommend. The same team that puts out the Fresh Connection game, so that people can really get a hands-on simulation about using circular as a strategy. And then we're going to spend 2 days going really deep into what makes circular hard for supply chain. We sometimes struggle with just carrier claims, like a tiny return is hard for us. Our large systems don't like to wiggle or bend or loop. And so how can we support these types of business models that will be very quickly emerging and we'll need to be able to address? That's going to lead to major shifts in our field. And I'd love for us to get out ahead of that. And that's why I'm so excited that ASCM will be there, home of the SCORE model. I put out a white paper for the SAPIX conference in June about, based on the SCORE model, where are some of the changes that, the shifts that will happen to our supply chain habits. And so ideally at the end of these 2 days, we'll have, a good understanding and dialogue around challenges, shifts coming, and then how can we start to get out ahead of these shifts? As an industry, how do we want to see the future looking? And I'm already speaking with ASCM about conference in New Orleans next year, 13th to the 15th of September, and we'll be heavily discussing and focusing on circular economy there.
Outstanding. Gosh, there's so much. 2 days is not enough, man. Y'all could be there for a month.
I know. I tried to make it longer, but people told me they probably can't get away. It's the week before Thanksgiving, so I'm pushing it as it is.
Well, it's so. I'm kidding, but it's so important to sit down, take some dedicated time to dive into these topics and great partner with AS. It's neat to see GE and ASCM get together. Two very recognizable global brands, and I'm looking forward to kind of seeing what comes out of it. In fact, we'll have to have you back on, maybe some key takeaways from that Paris event.
Absolutely.
And that's at your innovation center in Paris, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, there's talking about reclaiming old buildings. It's a beautiful building, really hosting lots of different types of companies in there now. We've got this great innovation center where we bring in industrial companies, apply design thinking, and investigate how data science can get their processes running better.
Love it. Okay. Gosh, we just wrapped up conference in Vegas, and the next one for ASCM is going to be in New Orleans, which we'll try to include some dates on the runner show notes as well. All right, so beyond the Paris event, which is the much more exciting, I love webinars, not taking anything away from you, but that is
it is a pretty cool webinar.
Yeah, well, and let's do it justice. So let's talk about the webinar next Wednesday. Is it open for anybody?
It's open for anybody. Yeah, it's 7 a.m. Pacific time, as I'm based on the West Coast. Okay. But it'll be recorded. So if you register, you'll get the recording. It's only half an hour. We kept it really brief. And again, it really investigates Industry 4.0 and this transition and extension of lean management into the circular economy. So if you are applying Lean, Six Sigma, Kaizen in your operation, you're probably already starting to apply circular strategies and you don't even know it.
And we'll include a note, but can folks go to GE Digital, Google that, and then find their way to the...
Yep, absolutely.
webinar? Okay, great. So let's kind of wrap up on, let's go broad, right? We've talked about some heavyweight issues, but what else in the world of and in global supply chain, what else is on your radar, other topics, challenges, you name it, more than others right now?
Yeah, we briefly touched on this earlier. The increase in women in supply chain is actually really encouraging to watch. And I sit on the board for my old university program up at Western Washington University, and we started tracking gender to say, wow, are we actually being intentional about creating opportunities? And we see, in high schools, in middle schools, more girls being encouraged to go into STEM fields. It's pretty sad, actually, just being a little bit of a bummer. By age 7, girls are already saying, I'm not as smart as boys, I'm not as fast as boys. And so somehow already that happens really, really, really early. And so we were briefly speaking before the show about engaging in elementary schools about supply chain. And actually, this is another passion area for Abe Ashkenazi over at ASCM. And they developed a elementary school friendly version of the beer game, which you've probably played if you're a supply chain professional.
Yep.
And so they actually had the lemonade stand game that they go in and play in elementary schools, and then the cell phone game for middle and high schools. And we're seeing more women get into the space. And I have a theory on this. I've not actually tried to ever confirm this theory. But if I think about my own path in, was an academic one. And the supply chain field is relatively new. Now you can find it in most American universities.
Over 500 programs in the States right now. It's offering some sort of 4-year degree or 2-year degree or some kind of formal education course on supply chain management.
Fantastic. And 15 years ago, there would be a small handful. Yep. And so I think as we see an academic path in, we'll see more and more women. So I think back to my undergrad program, it was half women. My graduate program in supply chain, though, didn't have very many women at all. I would say more like 5 or 10%. And so it'll be an interesting one to watch. But I just recently went to Gartner's supply chain conference in Barcelona in June, and they had a breakfast that essentially celebrates women in supply chain. And I found this interesting. They previously had constrained it to women, and this year they invited men in the room, and I thought, wow, well, how else do we get women promoted? We need to actually have a holistic conversation. So that's one major trend I'm seeing, and I'm hopeful about that as we see, more women on boards means a higher financial success for a company, and that's been proven time and time again.
That's right. And it's not pitting the two. It's not two sides, but in terms of male versus female, it's not one side wins, one side loses. And so I think one of the most important things we can do is get more men involved in the conversation. I think I think we're up against an awareness challenge. I think you've got great people that would help out if they're just not aware.
Right.
And so we have a huge awareness issue, but I mean, just the numbers you just shared there, you mentioned that the undergrad program was about 50-50, but then as you move into the master's, 5 or 10%, and unfortunately, we're seeing the same percentages if you look at entry level. Believe it or not, folks, at least some of the studies I've seen, in terms of coming into certainly supply chain management programs and coming into industry, those numbers are closer than you would think at the 50-50. However, as folks get those early promotions and then the second promotions, and certainly in the C-suite, it becomes so lopsided. And to your point, I believe McKinsey did one of the last studies I saw where if the executive team, the more diverse they are, the stronger financial performance the organization is going to have.
That's right.
Okay. So I love that. We could spend that's near and dear, and it's important because it's important, but also as father of two daughters and married to a incredible female entrepreneur, we've got to move the needle on these things, right? We got to make sure that women know they can do, and especially young women, they can do whatever they want to do.
Absolutely.
All right. So what else? Anything else in terms of the bigger picture, the end-to-end supply chain? What else is on your radar more than others right now?
Yeah, this is going to be broad, and we've talked about it quite a bit already, but Industry 4.0 is a force. We're in the middle of it. It'll continue. And so I really encourage supply chain professionals, either at the beginning of their career or throughout their career, even 15, 20, 25 years in, to stay relevant. We need to get smarter. I'm not saying go out and get, a PhD in data science, but certainly understanding the different components, how digital physical will come together. There's a couple really interesting conferences really exploring digital physical for supply chain. And again, we see early innovators, and I expect in the next 5 to 10 years, this is normal. So to stay relevant, get ahead, get your feet wet in some of these topics, and the whole industry will be better for it. Yeah,
I think humans, all of us, we do not like change, right? And I think that's been, if anything's been proven, that's been proven. And I think, going back to your flavor of the month commentary, I think a lot of folks and myself included, may assign that to some of the technologies. But gosh, across the Industry 4.0 landscape, nothing could be further from the truth. And these are revolutionizing technologies, approaches, applications that are not just changing the supply chain world, but changing the business world, right? The global business world. Blockchain has gotten, a lot of people take pot shots at blockchain, but it's here to stay, and it's changing. That distributed ledger is changing how global trade happens.
Absolutely. We're seeing really interesting, there's a team in Rotterdam, actually, the Block Lab, I think it's called, and they are exploring improving supply chain processes with a different type of data structure. So just a quick example, as we ship cargo in a vessel on the ocean, maybe the sailing time is 2 days, but the bank transfer, takes 2 weeks. So there it is, 12 days of demurrage, 12 days of waiting. And what they're finding is they can actually use tokens which sit on this distributed ledger, very, very secure, and the bank is accepting that. So they can release the cargo as soon as it arrives, and now, wow, consider the savings both in time and cost.
Enormous. Okay, so I'd love to dive in more, but we'll have you back. We'll talk about some things we couldn't get to today. But how can folks, you're doing keynotes, you're doing events, webinars, you name it, podcasts now. You can add that to your resume. How can folks reach out if they heard something they like, if they heard something you're involved in, they want to learn more? How can they reach out to you and to GE Digital?
Great. Yeah, our website for GE Digital is active. The team is very diligent about responding to requests from there. I'm also very active in the LinkedIn community, posting quite a bit around circular economy, of course, and I'm posting about the different events upcoming or papers, etc. So definitely reach out to me there. There are not very many Deborah Doles, Dole like not sharp, in it, so it's tough to miss me.
I bet you've heard that your entire life.
That's actually how I tell people to spell it properly. It's not Dole, Doll, Dole, Dual. It really is DULL. Yep.
Well, anything but. Really have enjoyed your passion and your perspective and your thought leadership insights. You're involved in some really interesting, groundbreaking conversations, projects, technologies, and I've really enjoyed our hour together. For our audience, ge.com/digital is where you can connect with some of the things that they've got going on, including next week's webinar, right? Next Wednesday.
Absolutely.
Okay. Good stuff. Really big thanks to Deborah Dole with GE Digital for joining us here today. Safe travels to everywhere you're going between now and, of course, Paris. And we look forward to learning about some of the key takeaways from that event here in November.
Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
You bet. really enjoyed it, Deborah. Okay, so to our audience, as always, we're going to close on a couple of events that we're going to be at. We invite you to come out and check us out in person. And, for starters, if there's anything that you heard here today that you cannot find, you can't Google, you name it, you can shoot us a note to connect@supplychainradio.com, and we will get more information to you as best we can. First up, though, so next Wednesday for us, Deborah, we're going to be at the Georgia Manufacturing Summit. There's about 10,000 manufacturers in the state of Georgia, right? And next Wednesday, we're going to celebrate all of that with our friends at the Georgia Manufacturing Alliance. We've got keynotes from P&G and Kia. Did you see you may not have watched last year's Super Bowl, but there was a Telluride commercial. So Telluride is this new Kia vehicle. It had a really neat commercial. It's one of the more popular ones that really tells the story of West Point, Georgia, where Kia makes several vehicles. Well, Telluride now, they can't make enough. They can't make them fast enough. So I think for everyone's come off the line, it already has an order. It's already going somewhere.
Wow.
Yeah, no kidding. That is so they've got some secret sauce down in West Point, Georgia. But anyway, we're going to be hearing more about the Kia story. And registration is still open for the Georgia Manufacturing Summit here at the Cobb Gallery in Atlanta. You can learn more at georgiamanufacturingalliance.com. And if you're a vet and you're interested in making connections, adding to your network, gathering some market intel, I think we have still some free seats available. You can use the promo code USAVET at georgiamanufacturingalliance.com and get a free seat while they last. I think we're giving away like 50 free seats, which is outstanding.
That's tremendous.
Okay, and then past October 9th, we're going to be back in Charleston at the South Carolina Logistics Tech Talk on October 23rd in partnership with the South Carolina Council on Competitiveness. You can learn more about that event at sccompetes.org. DHL Supply Chain will be keynoting that, focused on logistics tech, freight tech, supply chain tech, which is such a dominant force here these days. And then we're talking about London. It sounds like you're London's #1 fan, which is great to hear, Deborah. We love our friends at EFT, which is based in the UK. They are holding their Logistics CIO Forum in Austin, Texas in November on 7th and 8th. We'll be there. We'll be broadcasting live. We'll be featuring some senior leaders at the intersection of supply chain and technology. Looking forward to that. You can learn more at EFT.com. And then while we're working on some other events, it's hard to believe we're talking end of the year 2020. But Reverse Logistics Association Conference and Expo out in Vegas in February. Deborah, you touched on returns and reverse logistics. That is there's so many companies struggling to figure out their approach there. And it's such an expectation from a consumer standpoint, right? That's how e-commerce happens these days. But RLA is doing a great job of disseminating best practices. So look for more information there on that event. That's going to be in February. And then, of course, Modex. You ever been to Modex, Deborah?
I've not,
It is one of the, if not the largest, one of the largest supply chain trade shows in North America. 35,000 people they're expecting.
That's more than the town I grew up in.
It's encouraging in many ways, right?
Absolutely.
Because there's so much interest these days. I think many folks, whether you're consumers or whether you're, in some non-supply chain industry, we're all making a connection that to get our stuff in 2 days or less, that's supply chain.
Absolutely.
Right? But Modex 2020 is free to attend, which is really neat. You can go to modexshow.com for more information there. But we're going to be broadcasting throughout the 4 days, and they are hosting our 2020 Atlanta Supply Chain Awards. They're on site with Modex being the backdrop. We have secured our keynote, which is Christian Fisher, President and CEO of Georgia Pacific. So you can learn more at the new website we're developing now, fast and furiously, AtlantaSupplyChainAwards.com. Look for more information and details to come. So once again, great conversation. Really enjoyed it. I admire the passion and your bias for action, right? And driving the conversation and driving the things that supply chain leaders and organizations should be talking about. So big thanks to Deborah Dahl with GE Digital for joining us. To our audience, be sure to check out other upcoming events, replays of our interviews, other resources at supplychainradio.com. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, YouTube, all the leading sites where podcasts can be found. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. On behalf of the entire Supply Chain Radio team, this is Scott Luton wishing you a wonderful week ahead, and we will see you next time on Supply Chain Radio. Thanks, everybody.